Okay, great. Dear colleagues, dear friends, again, great pleasure to welcome Kristіан Дж, continuation of our mini-series of lectures dealing with his research, field research in South Sudan. Extremely interesting, extremely enlightening, and today Kristіan will be focusing on his research methods on data collection. Extremely useful stuff. Confuse bolts and nuts, right? Bolts and nuts. Bolts and nuts of the social science. Something that we, or most of us, unless someone is involved into history as a history of ideas, most of us are involved into this craft. Data collection, data analysis, data interpretation. So without further ado, Kristіan, we're pleased to have you. Extremely grateful to you for your commitment to Ukraine, to KPI, and the floor is yours.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for that, again, that generous introduction. I'm so happy to be with you again. For those of you who are listened live yesterday or got a chance to watch the recording, or will do so later, I'm going to kind of connect up to what I talked about last time. Last time I really went kind of deep in on the specifics of my research and South Sudan, but as Pavlo mentioned today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the research process that I undertook, or at least how I see the practice of qualitative research or ethnographic research. So I've called this talk "Researching the City: Interviews, Conversations, and Long Walks," which is just kind of my way of saying, kind of summarizing what I think research in the city in an urban context, which is what I was doing in South Sudan, primarily, though I spent some time in some more rural areas. The city and how to approach the city was the kind of focus of my attention, and what I'll talk about my approach to it today. So I'll talk about a couple of things. I'll just talk broadly about urban ethnography, or approaching the city as a field site, and some kind of approaches or some themes there. And then I'm going to talk specifically about something that was quite helpful and interesting to me. That was a theme to the research that I talked about last time. That's critical toponymy, or kind of thinking about names of places within an urban space as kind of a way into understanding a lot of, let's say, kind of more intangible or immaterial aspects of the city. It's a way in which to get at a lot of different things. So I'll talk about that a little bit, and what I think is helpful in that, in looking at cities, although it could apply to other places as well. And then I'll talk specifically about the method that basically my approach to conducting qualitative interviews. And I'm sure some of you have, conducted interviews of your own and done this kind of research and read texts. There's a lot of different resources around this, but I'll kind of just give a bit of my thoughts on what I think makes for an effective interview of the kind that I'm interested in, the kind of questions that I'm especially interested in. Well, as an urban anthropologist, someone who tried to study a city from the ground up, really understand it in person, how it was lived within, the way people were going about it, how people were remaking it. I would say this picture epitomizes my methodology. I really just tried to walk the city as much as possible. And there's a couple things about that. One is I always walked the city, walked different streets, different parts of the city, tried to visit as many different sections of it as possible with people. And doing that, makes you attentive to a lot of the kind of daily goings on of the city, but also allows you, when you move with someone, they bring their own history, their own map, their own kind of view of that space, and you can reflect on that, right? You see how, what spots, what landmarks are key to them, what spaces are important, where they go through, where they find people, where they meet up with people, what kinds of things they can point to that are there, that used to be there, particular aspects of their own personal history with the city, and just getting a sense of the place as it's lived, as it's experienced. Now, in South Sudan, to me, this was also especially important because, um, I was approaching the city. I was wanting to understand the city also from a grounded view, from the way that people who were uh, sort of everyday or kind of not elite folks were living and experiencing the city. And I tried to get as wide range of a group of interlocutors to talk to and to explore the city with. But I think also I tried to be in and exist in the city in the way most South Sudanese in Juba do, which is walking, not and taking public transport, not riding in their own car, not moving through it fast, but having to kind of move through it in this particular way. And the city looks different to you and exists differently when when you're on your feet, right? There are roads that you can access. They look different. I think also the walls of large UN compounds feel more imposing. They feel more closed off. You feel alienated from the city in different kinds of ways. And so all of that walking, moving through the city, to me, um, uh, that was really central, moving through the city in the way that other people do. So I'll also say that there is a bit of a difficulty in talking about qualitative research and trying to kind of offer a broad scope or any kind of easy or readily applied takeaway about anything, because every context is obviously quite different. And the way in which you have to encounter a place, the way you can be in a place, um, who you are in relation to that place, whether you're native to the city or the country that you're within, or you're not, how you look, appear, experience, the networks you're connected to, is going to so deeply alter the way in which you approach things. There's a way in which we can have a lot of expectations or ideas about how to do qualitative research, but they're always going to have to get matched to a particular context, right? So I just say that as a caveat because I think there's actually a challenge, and I think among certainly anthropologists, there's almost a reluctance at times to try to um, uh, make too broad of a statement about methods because every project, every context is quite distinct. Um, so a way I can talk about my approach and what specifically I was looking at. This is a quote I think is quite helpful. Kind of frames it in a nice way. Um, that urban anthropological research, right? Sociologists have been looking at cities as these kind of high modernist spaces for a long time. Urban anthropology has been has kind of less of a history because anthropologists have been so tied to uh, rural spaces or thinking that culture kind of exists not in the city but in outside of the city, which is kind of a problematic construction. But anyway, I think our urban anthropologists and urban anthropological research, you can say, has, as this quote says, has explicitly taken the urban as its object of study, understanding the city more as a set of processes than as a setting, and taking its material and spatial form into explicit account. Urban anthropologists seek to understand the changing nature of urban social life, the influence of urban space and place, and more broadly, what constitutes a city in the context of global flows and connections. So I think this is what certainly coming from my perspective as a qualitative social scientist, but also an anthropologist, that I think of urban spaces as kind of sui generis, kind of their own kind of places, and I think of them as processes being constantly made, remade by people, right? And you have to think about the context, historical context, global context, but also how people in the city are making and remaking it. So one way that anthropologists have thought about, and social scientists, I think more broadly, have thought about being a researcher in the city is to think of yourself as something like an urban flaneur, um, which is to say a wanderer, a stroller, someone who has no specific relationship with the places he or she is interested in, and is eager to make contact with everyone who happens to cross his path and in his quest to discover what the inhabitants do and think. I think ideally, if you're someone who wants to study a city specifically, but any kind of space that brings a lot of people together, you have to be able to kind of float between people, move around, move among uh, different spaces, get to know the place, and really try to see it as a not a tourist, but as someone who is able to move between parts of it with a bit of an objective lens, but also be able to situate themselves differently, right? And this concept makes me think of Georg Zimmel's famous essay about the city, right? And how he talked about modernity and the city, and I think it's Metropolis and Mental Life, right? That the city ultimately was a space of exploration, but one of also alienation, right? So you as a researcher may have a particular perspective on the city, but often you also are, not of every part of the city, even if you are from the city you're studying. Um, but you have to kind of find a way in which to float among all the various groups and spaces and places that are there in some way to kind of get be open and be sort of socially promiscuous in a way, get to know people, be willing to interact and be kind of open to those kind of interactions. And that's what I try to do in my research, especially in a place that was uh, changing quite rapidly, had a lot of different kinds of people moving throughout it. I was always trying to kind of strike up conversation with whoever was willing to and have that openness to my approach. So a couple of key themes to kind of speak to what kind of urban anthropology is, or urban ethnographic study is seeing the city as a process, right? um, Seeing it as something that's always being made and remade, right? It may be have been designed or implemented in one way, but it is always in the state of becoming and changing. I think thinking about space and power, who dictates who can be where, how this operates, what kinds of histories, infrastructures, politics, and access dictate who can be where, or who feels comfortable in what part of the cities and in what ways. But also recognizing space as something that's open, right? That just because a public park was created to be a place of leisure or to have a particular kind of activity within it, it may become transformed by, a set of artists, or it may be turned into a site of protest, or it may be become a place for uh, uh, different kinds of economic activity. So space is always something and urban spaces are always open to be remade. And we have to conceive of them not as set and as defined, but as being continually redefined. Also, and I talked about this in my previous talk. This a theme. This was kind of a theme to the research that I presented last time. That migration, globalization, the linking of cities and spaces reshapes them in a lot of ways, right? How particular cities and particular parts of cities are connected to the global economy, whether they're trying to be conducive to inviting a lot of people from the outside, whether there is a large degree of humanitarian intervention or international interest that reshapes and remakes certain spaces, but also processes of migration, immigration, and that might be recent, or that might be the legacy of migrations that happened historically, right? All of these things are kind of things that are linking the cities to other places, right? The city is connected to places regionally, regionally and internationally. So as much as cities, we often think about cities being remade by the global economy, right? And the way in which certain cities are global cities in a way, or are especially linked up to a global economic system. They're also made and remade by informal economies. And often, I mean, a lot of cities, this may be, especially in the global South, right? The informal economy might be the thing that is the most central in people's experience of a place, that they are actually working within, getting money from, and interacting with the informal economy, much more so than they are with the formal economy, right? So to leave that out would be ignoring a great deal of what's going on. In South Sudan, there was, because there's a bit of a ongoing dollarization of the economy, and the exchange rate has fluctuated a great deal. There's two exchanges that exist, and the good exchange rate only exists for people who can access the banks. But if you want to get dollars and trade South Sudanese pounds for dollars, you have to go to the black market, and trade with people informally. And a lot of people want to trade money, exchange money to send abroad, or to travel with, because the South Sudanese currency is so devalued. So therefore, people's kind of main interaction with the economic system is in an informal sector, in the informal sector, right? So that becomes kind of the key part of the city. And also, as I talked about before, and related to all this, that we have to think about the theme of identity, right? And how people identify with the city, or different parts of the city, how they feel connected to it. Do they feel as if they belong in the place, are made to belong to particular enclaves or communities within the city? But that the city is made up of every city is always made up of a multiplicity of people. And to borrow a word from Mikhail Bakhtin, we can think about it, the heteroglossia of the city. But there is a lot of different, not only languages spoken, but different kind of frameworks and cultural identities and ideas of what the city is and how it exists, that are there simultaneously, right? They're not layered. One is not replacing the other, but they're happening simultaneously. And also, obviously, relevant to a lot of contexts is the city as both remade by conflict, and that the city can be both a battleground, it can be a place where conflict plays out, but cities often are spaces of refuge as well. And there's some interesting work, certainly in urban African studies, where they've looked at cities being remade by conflict when there has been destruction, but also actually, surprisingly, cities becoming bigger economic spheres and larger communities as a result of conflict, because they did not have conflict happen directly in them, but because people sought refuge and there was a large influx of humanitarian aid, cities kind of there are cities that have kind of grown tremendously. So Goma and the Democratic Republic of the Congo is an example of that. It's a place that was a smaller town and had been the site of sort of skirmishes between the government and different forces, but as a result of how much humanitarian and UN intervention and migration there was to that, it's become a much larger town, and actually a much more stable city as a result, right? So conflict and sort of broader political forces can remake cities in quite surprising and contradictory ways. So it's a thing to be attentive to in thinking about how these processes play out. So we have an issue with, just to speak about the context I'm talking about, right? Thinking about urban spaces or cities as a site for work or qualitative analysis, right? Because most ethnographic methods that anthropologists employ, there's kind of a presumption of a bounded place, right? A singular place. I'm going to go to this, rural area and meet with this set of people, and there's a pretty clear cultural order, social structure, set of political institutions that are at play in this place. And Therefore, to study it is pretty straightforward. I just have to understand who's in charge, what's going on here, all of that, right? So this was always a bit of of a uh, uh, a fiction, right? That all of these places that anthropologists, other social scientists historically were studying were always more complicated and changing than they thought. But cities are especially challenging because there's no singular um, cultural order or one set of people that ultimately one can identify as being the people of a city, right? Cities are always quite vast and changing, have a lot of different kinds of people moving through them, right? So they pose a particular kind of challenge as a methodological object. And so there's certain ways in which we have to kind of recognize that as a thing that we can't study the city in its totality in the way that we might think that we could study a single community in a rural area in its totality and really understand it. Um, but uh, uh, what we can do is look at particular things or have a certain kind of approach to looking at urban spaces. So we can look at particular places or enclaves, right? Certain parts of the city. And my talk last time was, excuse me, focused mostly around one neighborhood, right? And kind of different experiences of that neighborhood. And that allows you to have a certain kind of focus there. But you can also follow certain kinds of people through varied spaces and social worlds to kind of track the fact that someone is part of this social network in their home, but out in their job or different sort of activities. They're enmeshed with a different social world that kind of other parts of the city become relevant to them. They move through different parts. So following particular personal sort of journeys and paths and movements through the city is another way to kind of track it. Not to try to study the whole city, but this person's experience of it. That becomes an interesting way, right? Kind of following along with people or kind of tracking what are the important spaces for them or the locations that they move through. I mean, another important thing is to do a kind of studying up, right? Or looking at planners, elites. How have people especially attempted to define and design the city to enact certain things, to kind of make certain ideas relevant, or to make certain spaces operate a certain way, right? What kinds of controls or social engineering is going on in cities. And that can be important as a way to kind of understand the success of certain kinds of projects, but also the failures or the kind of discontinuities or the ways in which things don't go as planned. It's a way to kind of look into politics and law and legal frameworks and change in a very specific way. One really compelling example of this is I'm not thinking of his name right now, but there's a book about Brasilia in Brazil, which was a new capital city that was built, and it was really built to be this kind of um, modern city and kind of represent socialist ideals in this way, but ended up not being very used or liked by people once it was built, right? So to kind of have these lofty aspirations as to the way it was going to remake politics and the economy and economic conditions, but it kind of ended up being this kind of a city that most people felt fairly alienated from. So that's an interesting contrast one can look at when looking at plans, intentions, and things like that. And related to that, looking at spatial realities, looking at the way in which people look at spaces, understand what the city, what the built environment of the city looks like, what it feels like, and what that reflects more broadly about the broader social and political conditions, right? So the fact that, as I was talking about in my talk last time, a person experienced this particular part of the city as their new home. This reflected a kind of history of being displaced throughout the country and during the war, right? So, what does the space, the kind of environment look like to them, and how does that reflective of these broader conditions or notions, right? Yeah, and you can look at monumental design, architecture as standing for like a certain kinds of approach, maybe imitations of certain foreign modes, right? Like our cities trying to be built to look like other cities or other buildings in some way, or to be attractive to foreigners. And then the policing and controlling of certain spaces, gating, formal and like socially gated, right? Like things that are actually closed off, but also things that are physically closed off, but also things that like feel uncomfortable for certain people to enter in certain ways, right? And how that happens and what that looks like. And part of this can also be looking at public art, the reclaiming of spaces, the remaking of spaces, graffiti, all of these kinds of things I think are quite fascinating lenses, frameworks from which one can look at broader dynamics, right? You can look at the material place in order to understand something bigger and something immaterial in a lot of ways. And as I said, naming and kind of critical naming, which I think is quite interesting, is something that's interested me as a lens, as a way into looking at what cities are and how they operate. So another methodological approach I would mention is kind of what I mentioned more before when I talked about walking the city. It's kind of mental mapping, right? What does one's how if people are to sit down and kind of map or trace or even guide you through the city, what do they see as salient? What are the locations that are important? What are what are the highlights? What are the focus points? And what histories do they invoke in saying this is my map of the city. These are my paths. These are the places I go. This is the parts of the city that are salient to me. And that's interesting to look at in contrast to official maps, right? That might demarcate particular landmarks that other people would not designate, right? And that sometimes can be even places that are not there anymore. There was a section of South Sudan that was called Juba, that was called High Cinema. So basically cinema, like the neighborhood by the cinema, but there was no cinema there anymore. But there had been a famous cinema theater there at some time. So people still identified that area as being that place where that meeting point had been, right? Even though it was not more. So through mapping, sort of thinking through the spaces of the city and what's salient to people, one can kind of draw out life histories, which I think is quite important, and kind of life histories, especially in and through the city. Where did you live? What areas were important to you? When did that change? How did you come to the city? What did the city look like then? Excuse me. These particular things, I think, offer a deep and rich kind of understanding of a place. And thinking about the urban sensorium, right? Not just the built environment, but how the city sounds, how it smells, images, tastes, movements. There was a great ethnography that I read that was about these taxi drivers. I think it was in Cairo, and there was a number of sermons that were on cassette tapes that got passed around, and so they talked about just how like this kind of urban audio kind of landscape was there that existed, that kind of tracked what was going on in terms of how people were understanding politics and the economy and the moment, but that you had to like think of in terms of like just the audible processes, the things people were listening to, and how that was making and remaking the world for people. So it's important to move through and take in the city, not just think of it from the top down. And this quote from an urban anthropologist that I like is just thinking about studying the city as dancing together, eating together, joining a dense crowd of protesters, that these can all produce powerful embodied feelings of belonging. That you want to that the city is a place to be lived in, moved through, and that you as a researcher have to kind of experience that in some way in order to really get it in some way. So let me talk a little bit specifically about one of these things I mentioned that's been kind of a helpful point to me, which is thinking about names of places. And this can be in the city, but this can also be in other contexts. I think looking at naming, especially official names and unofficial names, or kind of competing names for places, as a way to look at claims and also kind of understand placemaking. So there's a couple of social scientists have called this critical toponymy, or kind of just looking at and analyzing place names, looking at cultural methods, textual methods, historical methods. And this names, of course, are especially important and contested in cities. Um, and we should also think about names as a technology of power, right? That street names will streets, cities themselves, parts of cities, neighborhoods get named or renamed in order to reflect a certain set of controls, or who is in charge, or what era we're in, or defining history in some way, or defining what figures or who to memorialize in different ways, right? So naming is always doing something, right? It's never neutral. So it can be a strategy for asserting sovereign authority or symbolic power in some ways. But it also is a site of contestation, right? That it can be a way to gain recognition, to reclaim something, to claim something, to kind of assert ownership in a kind of indirect way. So this is a way you can look at a politics of resistance in some ways that isn't like protest or active resistance, but is just kind of finding a way to assert presence or ownership in a particular kind of space. And I think this is especially interesting to look at the kind of history of names and names of places, and how there might be a particular kind of formal or kind of official history, but people also might have their own histories that contradict that, right? Or a different reading of that, or a kind of different sense of how that came to be. And that's quite fertile grounds to kind of analyze, right? To see, well, if this was named this way towards this purpose, what does it mean that no one is calling it by that name, right? Or it retained that name. What does that tell us about the situation here, right? In South Sudan, there were roads that were given new names, official names after independence, but I never heard people actually referring to those names. And also, as I talked about in my talk before, there might be different people who are calling the same neighborhood by a different name, and it's reflective of a personal history and association, but also a sense of what they want out of the city, what they expect, who they want to own it, right? So these things are never neutral, and they actually give us a quite interesting dynamic sort of focus of our attention to analyze, right? Because naming, just to kind of quickly go through it, it kind of creates notions of belonging, can kind of create a sense of inclusion or exclusion. And it can grant to kind of citizenship, like a social citizenship, a cultural citizenship, to people in particular places. And names can also memorialize, but they can also less officially just be a kind of a mnemonic, or just kind of a way to remember something in a more straightforward way, right? Um, so toponyms, we could say, are expressive and constitutive of the politics of citizenship, conferring a greater degree of belonging to certain groups over others, while also serving as sites for battles to widen the distribution of citizenship and the use of space. So in other words, I find this interesting to look at names just as a way to kind of get at
Just staying here, having met here, right?
sorry? Okay. As just kind of a way to get at sort of broader kind of contradictions and dynamics that might be going on. So to give a couple of examples, so one example, this is from a text that I quite like, that has a number of pieces on naming as a kind of critical analysis. It's a book called Political Life of Urban Streetscapes. And what they talk about, they have a chapter about a dynamic in the American context, which is naming streets after the civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and how this kind of comes to be, and also how this gets contested. And they look at a specific kind of process. There was actually a series of debates and discussions on the city council, and the analysts were looking at how what those debates were saying, and how in this particular case they were debating how a number of uh, property owners said, well, we're okay with this section of this street being named after Martin Luther King, but not this section, right? This commercial district, we want to maintain it as this name, but the other section should be maintained as that name. And the community that was opposing that was pushing for the whole street, running the whole length of the city, to be renamed for Dr. Martin Luther King. They were saying that was kind of an exclusion. That was kind of saying that, oh, well, this section is only for a certain set of people, and therefore it can be named after this leader, and this other part of the city doesn't belong to us. So you're kind of excluding us from there, but it should actually be that the whole street is named after him, right? So it's an interesting way in which these kinds of discussions, these particular things, can kind of materialize or give us a lot to look at, think about, for these kind of more complex processes and discussions and debates that are going on. So I think for all qualitative social sciences, anything like this, where there's this really clear, distinct moment or event or situation that we can delve into deeply and look at its history, look at how people are approaching it differently, that's very fertile grounds for us to kind of focus our attention on. So I think something like a street name gives us that kind of interest. This is coming from my research. This is what I talked about last time, how this is a name. There were multiple names for this one neighborhood, and that ended up being quite interesting as a reflection of different experiences of the city and also expectations for South Sudanese politics going forward. And another example from South Sudan, there are a couple of neighborhoods that are the government is aiming to change, and that has to do with the fact that these areas are named for one is called Rajal Mafi, the other is Atlabara, both taken from Arabic, and these names actually refer to particular moments when the country was at war, and the city, the state was trying to kind of find any rebels or rebel sympathizers within the city of Juba. And so in one section of this, people would say, people would hide the men would go to another area of the city, and the women would stay behind. And so when the army came by, the government army came by, they would just say, Rajol Mafi, there's no men here, right? You don't have to look here for the people you're looking for. And then in another section, Labara memorializes the fact that similarly the government forces were going around trying to call people out and try to capture them. So these names, the government in some ways, and the city government wants to kind of move away from, because they have kind of these negative connotations for this history of the previous government order being there and kind of extracting violence. But in my experience, hearing people tell these stories about this, there was a power and an importance to them in recognizing some of this history and remembering what had happened in these places, and wanting to not repeat that history or kind of have a reflection. So while there were no memorials or sort of demarcations officially of what had happened in these spaces, that people would still refer to this history, these events that happened, and call these neighborhoods by these names, was reflective of the fact that they wanted to remember this violence, these violent episodes, remember what had happened, kind of keep that history alive in some way in what they were doing, right? So these kind of unofficial names actually had a lot of significance. And I heard, various versions of these stories. And so it was interesting for me to continue to ask people like, oh, what was your understanding of what that name means? And I would hear the same stories, right? And the same kind of sense of why it was important to call these names by those names. So I guess I'll leave questions to the end, and I'll just kind of move on to talk a little bit about. I have a lot of slides here because I pulled this from when I teach my methodological class to my undergraduates here at my university. I'll go through a couple of points here a bit more quickly so we can have some discussion. Um, because interviews I think are kind of central to all qualitative research. Certainly central to the research I was doing and the way I was trying to understand an urban space and also a place that was undergoing a great deal of change and that people had a lot of opinions and thoughts about, right? But I think interviews are also there's a continuum, right? I think there's a use of having formal kind of sit down interviews that are quite a bit more planned and that are kind of timed and that you kind of set your questions beforehand. But I also think kind of serendipitous conversations, discussions, um, they're also very important, right? And being able to spend time or get to know people and be able to have kind of more exchanges back and forth, those are also extraordinarily valuable, right? So I think we should recognize that this is on a continuum, right? There can be more formal thing, there can be sort of more there can be more formal things and there can be more informal things, and those are both super valuable sources of data for us to draw on. And actually, also, I think one can lead to the other. You can have a quite straightforward kind of casual conversation with someone and then say, hey, I'd like to sit back down with you and have that conversation again or talk through that more. I'd like to hear more about that and really record your answers, right? So a kind of informal conversation often is a great starting point for finding sort of longer uh, threads and themes to follow up with someone on. Um, Yeah, and so basically you might have for sort of formal interviews, set up interviews, sort of have interviewees recommend others, right? The kind of snowball method of finding interviewees. Um, and there's any number of ways to find particular people, find a person of interest. But also, as I said, like I think there's a value to kind of just trying to find people casually or through connections in a way, and not necessarily. And some of the best connections I had with people and discussions and data I got was just kind of by randomly someone had recommended someone else to talk to, or I found someone and they became a great person to talk with. And that I also think sharing is an important part of asking questions. And I think sometimes, since we're so interested in capturing the data, we don't think as much about this. Certainly, in a cross-cultural context, this is quite important. People were often very interested to ask me questions about the U.S. because they had heard about the U.S. But hadn't been there, or they had friends who had gone there, or had questions or wanted to hear about my background. And so, always leave that open. That it should be, even if it's a formal interview, there should be a sort of back and forth. There should be checking in to make sure you understand things, but also a sort of answering questions, offering your own thoughts, experiences, and all kind of sharing and kind of giving your insights and sharing back and letting them ask questions of you as well to leave time and space for that kind of exchange to happen. Um, so the kind of nuts and bolts of this, I mean, I think it's good to have an interview guide, but I think more of an outline, maybe some precise questions. But I also think printing this out, having this on a kind of a printed version of it, or on a notepad or something separate from, maybe a device that you're using to talk to someone on. Um, I think it's good to have this document. It kind of shows, I think it just displays that you've done the research. It also gives you something kind of that's a kind of anchor for your discussion to have this written out and have particular kind of an outline rather than survey questions, but like an outline of topics that you have. I think also making sure you test audio equipment beforehand, very important. Certainly, if you go and do sort of foreign field work and you want to make sure everything's working exactly how you expect, I had to always be concerned with making sure I had battery life and the ability to charge things. So you always have to think about the circumstances of recording, making sure things can record the right way, because the worst thing would be to do a tremendous interview and have no record of it. And I think in terms of the format of views, getting started, having a sort of extended time to introduce yourself and the project, even if you've talked to them before, explain your goal, go through the sort of anything that you've set up as your form of sort of approved research methods and gaining informed consent. Explain to them that, I think also reiterating to people that there's not a certain answer you're looking for, that you really value their perspective. They're the experts. Make them recognize and really say explicitly, I'm not trying to get the right information so much as like your interpretation of the world, right? And making it clear to them that you're not just trying to get that you really are valuing their thoughts and theirs, and their perspective, and that you want to get that. And remind them that things are going to be anonymized and whatever methods you're going to do, and that the notes are for your reference, all of those things, and seeking clarification, and have them confirm out loud their consent, of course, and record that. In South Sudan, it made more sense to have a kind of recorded oral consent rather than a written, because written documents sometimes felt a little bit too formal or might be official in some way. That people might not like. And I always say start the recording with all of this upfront information as well, right? Don't start recording after you do this, but get this recorded as well if you're going to record your interview. So now I'll just talk about, I have basically 4 principles, I'll call them, and these are adaptable, but these are kind of just more the things I try to think about, and what make for a good interview. And this is especially because especially when I teach this to undergraduates, right? And depending on your background, you may be more familiar with survey research or, certain kinds of research, other kinds of research. The ethnographic interview or a qualitative interview really is something that can get at a different kind of data, right? So I think my goal is always to kind of use the strengths of it to get at something that you would not be able to get at otherwise, right? What are the kinds of questions I can ask that would not elicit the kinds of questions I could better ask in a survey, right? Or in a written statement of some kind, right? What are the questions I can ask that will really give me something rich and deep and interest that's quite distinct from what I could get from other kinds of methods, right? So there's, for that reason, I kind of have 4 kind of ways that I think about what are the key ways to go about interviewing, and these are them. So one is seek the concrete, and I'll explain each of these in turn. The second one is, I say, capture subjective truth. Be deliberate in your affect, like the way that you're presenting yourself in the interview itself, and then follow-up questions matter most, which maybe is not exactly true, but is my way of saying that, as I'll explain, listening to what's being said and then eliciting more based on what is said is actually quite key, and is quite an important skill to develop. So what do I mean by seeking the concrete? This is from a kind of famous textbook on qualitative interviewing, where the author says you want the respondent to provide concrete descriptions of something they've witnessed. This includes scenes, events external to the respondent and their own thoughts and feelings. I'll just summarize this, but basically he says the kind of question you want to go for is, could you walk me through the last time you went in court? What happened? Right? Other questions that might also serve to elicit a concrete description include, could you tell me about a time that displays that at its clearest? Is there a specific incident you can think of that would make clear what you have in mind? Could you tell me what happened starting from the beginning? So in other words, these are all questions that ask people to go through and describe specific incidents and events rather than speaking in generalities, right? What's the last time that happened? Oh, can you give me an example of that you just spoke about and tell me that? Or, can you take me through when you came to know that? When did you start feeling that way? When did you start speaking that way? And this is going to get us much more interesting answers, much more concrete data, much more valuable data out of our discussions than if we were to just ask them their opinion on something. And everyone's willing and capable of just kind of giving a general thought, but getting them to pinpoint exact data points and things, right, is going to be quite productive to getting really interesting data and really useful and valuable data. So can you tell me about the last time, the most recent time that happened? Can you walk me through this? These kinds of questions. A particularly memorable moment when this happened, or you mentioned X. Can you tell me about a time that happened, an event that made you feel that way, made you aware of that, right? So having people talk in terms of very specific, concrete events, right? Think about it as this is you being able to observe events that they observed through them, right? You're able to kind of capture things that happen and events that happens without having been there yourself, right? So that could be their own personal history, that could be recent events, but getting them to talk, speaking in the concrete is quite important, right? And then even when they're talking have them substantiate with specifics, right? Can you give me an example? Was there a moment when that became clear? And you can follow up if you maybe know them already, you've already talked to them, follow up on a specific incident. You told me about this event. Can you go back and take me through that whole story from the beginning, right? I know that this happened to you. I know that you experienced this. Can you tell me about that? And then have them go through it point by point, right? What was your reaction to this, right? This happened. What was your reaction to it? Where were you when this happened? Who were you with? What did it feel like, right? Getting them to, elicit specifics about what their experience of something was, and the more concrete things. This is what qualitative interviews, ethnographic interviews can get at, and can pull the kind of data that we can get that ends up being quite fruitful. That would be hard to get in other ways, right? This is the kind of what I like about this, right? So the other side of it is, I would say, your goal should also be to capture subjective truth, right? You're not trying to understand things broadly. You're really trying to get their perspective rather than general knowledge. And I think it's as clear as possible, returning them to the concrete and to their experience or opinion, right? Don't have them just, if someone's just talking about generally giving you the history, oh, well, this happened here, and then this happened, try to return them to, well, when did you become aware of that? What did that look like to you? Or bring them into something specific, right? Another important thing here is have them comment on your interpretations, right? It seems to me that this is the case. Do you agree with that? Or someone might say that this is the case. Or what you might have learned in your background research or your ethnographic research so far. Oh, I've heard people say this about, this place. What's your reaction to that? Or what would you say to them? It seems to me this, would you agree with that? What would you add to that? What do you make of that? And you can also make this impersonal or remove yourself, right? A way someone could interpret X is this way, right? What do you think of that? How would you respond to that? So you can take yourself out or not pinpoint a specific person, but just say, here's a perspective. How would you react to that perspective? And that gets them to, really respond to something, right? It might be easier to answer a question like, well, what would you say to someone who feels this way? And that might be easier than, what do you think about X topic, right? They can respond. You're giving them kind of a more specific prompt there. And another important thing, I think, especially if you've already done some interviews or if you're working in a team that has conducted several interviews and you've been able to listen to other interviews, is you can put your interviewee in dialogue with others you spoke to, right? So someone else I spoke to seemed to think this. What do you think? Or like, oh, I heard this story. How would you respond to them? What would you do? You think this is a good description or interpretation of this? So have them explain their understanding by commenting on or re-explaining existing ideas about them or their worlds, right? Some people would assume this or think this. How would you respond? How would you correct that? Have you encountered that? Where and when? How would you respond? So this is a way that's kind of very, very productive in putting that where you can kind of put your interviewees or interlocutors in conversation with each other, because what you're doing is you're kind of letting them respond to each other, and then the social scientists can pull that together and have a really interesting set of materials to compare. So that's, I think, a very key thing, and something that I had to learn, and that I think is one of the most important things you can think about is how can you build on what you've learned, and how can you get at some kind of differences of experience through the interview. So my third thing, this is more just about how you as an interviewer should be, that I think is important. And this is just kind of be deliberate in the way that you present yourself and your affect. I think sitting in expectant silence, being able to like listen and just show that you're listening, and be comfortable with waiting for them to keep talking. Give them your full attention and eye contact. And I think demonstrate that you're listening, show that you're understanding what they said, you're thinking about it, even if you have to kind of force that or make it a little bit more over the top than is natural. I think that really brings out people's comfort and allows them to feel open, and willing. Don't interrupt them. That we as academics can maybe have trouble. We love talking, of course. That can be challenging, but resist your any temptation you have to kind of interrupt or add or even have them elaborate. I would say don't fill the silence yourself. Wait for expansion. And I think that really ends up getting you a lot of good information. And that patience, I think, is rewarded often. And so what I would do, and make it clear, as I kind of said before, that you're not seeking the right answers or the wrong answers, that you really are valuing them as the expert on this topic, and the expert on their experience. So make that, reiterate that, if they are saying, oh, well, I don't know about that, reassure them and say, oh, I'm just really interested in your take and what you have to say, and what you've experienced. And so you don't have to tell them that they don't have to apologize for their perspective or anything, that they really want to and value their insights. Also, sharing can be part of this. Sharing is part of asking questions. Checking to see that you understand something can be really valuable, right? Because it can prompt further discussion, encourages them, show that like, oh, I think I understand you saying this. Is that right? And that might allow them to expand on it or correct it in a way that's really productive to you, or useful to you. And mention what you've already learned, what you're thinking about, what you're trying to understand, right? You might find a way to pose your research questions in a kind of short, digestible way, and just kind of see how they react to it, right? Can demonstrate empathy with a brief anecdote or an affirmation, and like, oh yeah, I've done that before. That's been my experience, right? And just embrace this, this opportunity, sometimes not unusual opportunity for you and your interlocutor. How often do we really just sit and listen to other people, right? We often are in conversation, but how often do you really try to just be the listener? I think there's something we, as just kind of personally, we should kind of embrace that opportunity and the respect we're showing to other people by making them the subjects of what we're trying to understand, and letting them be the experts for us. So my fourth principle is that follow-up questions matter most. Maybe they don't matter the most, but they matter a lot. I think when people are talking, good practice is to jot things down that you want to follow up on, so that you can have that written and you can remember it, but you don't have to interrupt them, right? So I think that's a very useful practice, is like just jot things down. I think summarizing what they've said, and that leads them to expand. That's another way you can follow up. And ask them if it's accurate. I would describe your take as this. Is that right? Does that work? Have them clarify something, right? So if they mention something or return to a topic detail, like if you're taking a little bit of some notes while you're talking, and I think you should write things rather than rather than typing. I think just having being able to give them your full attention, and even if you're talking to them on Zoom or something, just showing that you're writing down what they're saying. I think it just creates a different rapport, and I think it also allows you to seem as if you're listening and paying attention rather than just trying to catch every word, which it could seem like if you're typing, that you're trying to just transcribe what they're saying. If you're taking notes, it more feels like, oh, you're reflecting on what they're saying. And that kind of changes the dynamic. And it also lets you be more attentive, right? So you can kind of jot down what they're saying, things you want to go back to. And then you can go back to them, right? And I think that's a useful thing to do, is to kind of have that note so that you can listen and pay attention and then kind of go back, right? Can you say more about that? You said X. Can you tell me more? Can you explain? Can you give me an example? Right? If you've taken a little notes, then once you've kind of have a lull in the conversation, then you can have them expand, right? But this is kind of where having a set guide of questions you want to follow, things you want to talk about is great, but also having that space to kind of follow up, expand, and explore, I think is just as important. So I think that's just about it on what I wanted to say there. And yeah, I can also share these slides at some point. That would be helpful, and any kinds of resources that you would be interested in. I'm happy to always share things. But that's about all I wanted to talk about in terms of talking about methods. Hopefully that was helpful. And happy to answer any questions, but also just have discussion and hear about your research as well.
Thank you. Fantastic. Again, can I jump into the fray? And two brief questions. First of all, what was the experience that struck you the most, both as a human being, as an American, conducting field research in faraway land, and as a researcher? I mean, what have you found out about this society, about social structure, way of life, that you did not expect you would have come across? Mm-hmm. And second, very quick question. You employed this ethnography methodology, ethnographic approach, which is essentially qualitative, right? What about quantitative data analysis? Does it exist in South Sudan? Do they have pollsters? Do they conduct public opinion polls? Because in Ukraine, it's a huge thing, and sometimes, well, not sometimes, it's more often than not, it's almost always sociologists are overshadowed by pollsters, and the media outlets publish public opinion polls, and they call it sociology. So it's kind of reductionism in action. So two things. Your revelations went there about yourself, maybe about your perception of the outside of the America, and do they have public opinion polls there? Because in light of what you've said and about that society, they do have issues with development, and I think would apply his definition of the development of underdevelopment. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'll take the second one first. So I think there's been some public polling there's a census office in South Sudan, but my understanding was they did a census that was a little bit challenged, and some of the social scientists were pretty skeptical of the results of it. For example, a country that had decades of war, the census said that there were more men than women, adult men than women in the country. And they just, on the face of it, a lot of the local social scientists said that didn't sound like it was probably true, right? That we just know the death rates in the conflict We just know that, that just didn't strike them as right. So I think there's been a challenge to get good data. To the extent that there is polling and that kind of quantitative analysis, so much of it is centered in the aid industry and humanitarianism, which is good in that they get tangible, close to the ground accountings of, displaced people, situations. But it is also very sector specific and can be a bit surface. And this was kind of what a couple of my students I had at the University of Juba when I was there. They had worked in the aid industry. They had kind of studied sociology and anthropology, and they were a little bit frustrated because they felt like UN reports or these NGO reports, they would have a lot of data and statistics and sort of analysis, but it was always just about very like it wasn't they felt like it didn't flesh out people's lives in a way, right? It was always about the access to water was insufficient here or nutrition here, and it was very, very focused on particular like crisis things without really getting a kind of more holistic view of what are people trying to do to rebuild, for example, or what are their lives looking like, what are they trying, and that and so that's kind of a challenge. I think logistically, it's a challenge to kind of do surveying and polls. There were some good polls, I think, done early on in South Sudan, but they were done by like American research firms coming in and trying to do kind of sample polls of opinions. But that's not something that regularly happens. So I think you end up getting, you don't end up having too much of that. As for things that struck me, I think, the first time I went to South Sudan, it was a year after its independence. So, and I was very interested and keen to kind of see what things would be like. I think the thing that struck me the most and continuously struck me was, and this kind of ended up being the main theme to my book, is the degree to which people were kind of looking forward and kind of in expectation of what was possible and what the future might bring, even when things were quite challenging. And it was kind of just something that you wouldn't expect. And I think especially, the narrative of African context where there's a political upheaval is, oh, it's awful, it's terrible, it's this and that. But people on the ground didn't talk in those terms. There was a way in which they were they were kind of expecting there to be tumult in the political situation, the economic situation, but they saw this as, in their view, it was like kind of like more of a process of becoming a new country, of things changing and things seeking something out. So that kind of, I think that aspect kind of struck me a great deal. In terms of social structure, a lot of kind of practices with when I went to some of the more rural areas. I think it was always surprising to me. I think that I had to get used to was in a lot of some areas I traveled to are polygamous, so there are just a lot of men who have many wives. And as a cultural anthropologist trying to talk about sort of my own social dynamics and everything, that they couldn't get they were surprised I didn't want to do a similar thing, right? And so that wasn't everyone, but it was a social dynamic that I continuously found kind of an interesting thing to confront, think about in terms of how people conceived of family life and all of that. Yeah, it's just kind of a quick answer, I guess.
One more question.
Sure.
How big is South Sudan? Ukraine is size of Texas and or France. And if you compare South Sudan with one of the American states, which one would pop up in your mind?
About the same, about the size of Texas, but only 8 million people or so. How many people in Ukraine?
Well, the last census was conducted over 20 years ago, so it's not full. Before the war, estimates were, well, slightly below 40 million, but we have over 6 million refugees, so it's a really tough call. So somewhere in between. But my colleague Andriy Khomyak will be able to discuss this in greater detail because he's conducting research on migration. So we are talking just about South Sudan. South Sudan itself is size of Texas. So how big is the rest of Sudan? It's ginormous.
Yeah, it's the rest of Sudan is quite big. But the thing that's interesting, that creates a lot of dynamics, is just that population density is quite low in Africa as a whole, right? There are places that are quite dense, but think about South Sudan is about the size of Texas, but only about 8 million people. It's quite 8, maybe 11. I've seen different numbers, but that's quite a small density. And I think and historically that's actually why you don't see large states or like sort of kind of political consolidation in some areas in the same ways you would see in other parts of the world. Like historically is partly, some people have suggested, because of that population density just being quite low comparatively in the land. So and most of them are in Juba. I think most of the people in South Sudan, a lot of them are in Juba. So
I have one more question. First of all, I would like to thank you for a really impressive and very interesting lecture and story. And I would like to ask, in what language have you conducted any interviews during this project?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I speak one of the languages in South Sudan, but there are over 60 local languages. People primarily speak, if they've had a formal education, English or Arabic. So I could conduct a lot of interviews in English and then work with interpreters to do interviews in Nuer, Dinka, Arabic, Bahari, depending on the context, right? So, and especially with the being in a city where it's very diverse, that's it's always a challenge, is finding the people, but also finding interpreters, right, and translators, and getting things across, right? So English. I was lucky that English is spoken a lot, but also made enough connections and friends that I was able to always have someone to interpret, because I always wanted to talk to a different people, a lot of different people. Yeah.
Thank you. How do you think, from the methodological point of view, what is the better format when you conduct interview, when a researcher conduct interview personally with a simultaneous translation, or when someone who knows the local language conduct interview as an interviewer, and then the transcript is translated into English? According to your experience and project you have conducted, what is the best way?
Yeah, to me, because I see qualitative interviewing as having to be kind of pretty dynamic, I think that simultaneous translation is super essential, because I'll always want to hear what's being said and then follow up and kind of expand on things, and kind of ask follow up questions. So and I think those are like so key to getting good data, that I think that seems pretty necessary to me. I also, I would say the other thing is definitely debriefing with and talking extensively with the translator beforehand, and just to make sure, like, especially this about since I think qualitative interviews, we're really trying, as I said, kind of trying to get at some kind of subjective truth, right? Like, reminding them, I don't want to know the right answer. I want to know their experience. So making sure that the translation and the kind of questions reflect that, I kind of try to debrief with that afterward, and before, right? Especially if it's something, and it also depends if your interpreter knows a lot of social science and knows kind of what you're doing in the project. It's different than if they're just kind of helping you out and they don't really necessarily know. So you have to have that kind of conversation to be like, listen, I don't just want facts necessarily. I really get, what their personal, experiences were. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you one more time for very interesting
Yeah. Oh, thank you so
conversation.
much. Great to have you. Yeah.
Okay, Vladislav, after me. Thank you for your interesting lessons and practical advice. My questions is more about a practical aspect of conducting interviews. Is it possible to conduct an depth and relevant interview via video communication tools, for example, Zoom, or is this impossible?
I think it's very, very possible. I think it's very helpful. I think that what's important there is just treating it as if you're in person as much as possible. So to me, like one simple thing is just having like a notebook where I'm taking notes and keeping my eye contact, so that it doesn't feel as if I'm multitasking or typing what they're saying. I think maintaining that, like, I think just solicits a kind of conversation where they don't, where that happens. So I think that kind of interview, I think that video interview absolutely is quite, it's quite conducive, quite good. I think it's just, I would just think a bit about like how do I make it feel less zoomy or less on the computer, right? How do we make this feel really like we're having like an in-person conversation? There's just a couple of things that you can do that I think make that happen, so that you just get the flow of conversation in a way that is key, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Vlad, have you questions?
Yeah, sorry. I want to go back to, talking about interviewing in South Sudan, in Juba, with entrepreneur. Because I had a similar question with a person who asked about it first. But I want to know, was there any problem, like trust issues, when you're doing an interview with people who don't speak English, but involving an entrepreneur in the process? Because I just thought about that if you do interview like this in my home village and asking some questions like about how people live there, and that's some strange foreign man for local people, it would be hard to trust you, there was actually a problem with that, as I think, because now we have a lot of organizations who wanted to give some money for local business to support them, and local business just don't accept it because they think, oh, if I took it, they gonna come back a few years later and take all that we have, and it's really slows economical recovery in a way. So yeah, it's I'm sorry, I just
Oh no, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. So definitely it's a big issue. And there's a couple things that I think about a lot. So first of all, like obviously I don't look South Sudanese, and so people make a number of assumptions. And hearing I'm American, they assume, oh, is he a journalist? Or a spy, right? Or maybe that's the same thing. Or a lot of times, people would assume I'm trying to start up a business or start an NGO project. Um, So that's where, and I don't want to ever interview someone or talk to people on kind of false premises, and if they think something or they're suspicious or anything like that. So I definitely always spent a lot of time getting introduced and introducing myself into situations. So I never went to any community out. I mean, Juba I could move around in, and it's a large city. But any community, I always went with someone from there and had them introduce me to local authorities. So that was like the formal authorities, but also kind of local leaders, and had them explain, and tried to explain at length, and also tried to bring like formal documents saying that I got research approval. But my goal always was especially to like make sure people knew that I wasn't doing a kind of NGO project or intervention project, because understandably that's what they would kind of assume. So as much as I could say like, oh, I'm interested in culture and I'm from the university, and so that they first of all are going to decide whether they want to talk to me or not based on that. Because if they only want to talk to me because they think I'm bringing a big project, that's obviously not upfront and straightforward. But also, I don't want to set up the expectation that because of talking to me, I'm going to bring opportunities or things. So I think recognizing those suspicions, and I think this is where also like I tended to interview, if I did formal interviews with people, I always kind of connected with them through someone else. You know, met them organically, like moving around the streets and kind of got to know them, or was introduced to someone by someone else. So here's for example, one really interesting guy I talked to was kind of a local entrepreneur in Juba, and he was just kind of known as someone that people trusted and liked, and so but I met him through someone else who was just like told me like, oh yeah, this guy would be really interesting for you to talk to because he knows a lot about the area. But they also did a lot of the work for me in explaining like, oh, he's a teacher who's working at the university. He's not with an NGO. He's not with the U.S. government. I think taking the time to kind of have those formal introductions, and also focusing on, I didn't try to pursue things that were inaccessible or talk to people that weren't interested. I tried to really make genuine connections and friendships, and that's what I think my research is built out of those deep long-term connections rather than any kind of short or quick discussions or anything like that, right? Or my attempt to get at something quickly. If that makes sense. I don't know if that answers your question, but
I have one more small question, if the colleagues allow.
yeah.
I would like to ask if you applied any incentives for the respondents during the interview.
Yeah, I think it kind of depended. I would usually have something small that I gave them. If it was someone that I was just meeting up for the interview setting. Obviously there were a lot of people I knew and was friends with that I had ongoing relationships with. I definitely did, and certainly anyone who was in an official capacity, government work or anything, I didn't hand things to. But definitely for people who were um, uh, kind of I was just meeting just for the interview. And I think I also made sure how to think about it and frame it kind of from a cultural perspective, and the way that my friends there, South Sudanese friends, would often say like, "Oh, it's good to give someone a thank you." They didn't call it compensation. They more thought of it as like a sort of a gesture of graciousness, right? And sometimes it's just like, I know, like, sometimes it's just something that they would want that's like, takes a little bit of travel to go purchase. I know in one of the rural areas, getting elders some decent tobacco to put in their tobacco pipes, right, from the market was just something they really appreciated. It was like not something that was inaccessible, but it was just like a nice gesture. But framing it also as like, I'm not paying you to do this. I'm just saying this is my way of thanking you for your time. I think, everyone's, every context is different in terms of who they are. But I think definitely people who I was just meeting just to conduct an interview with, I would kind of find the compensation that was appropriate and was not like in a crazy amount of money, but also felt, like uh, a good amount. Yeah, if that makes sense.
But were the respondents aware that they can expect for some compensation or present or gift after the interview? And in light of this, when I'm talking about anthropological interview, how do you think, based on your experience, if this incentive or maybe gift can have some impact on people who are ready to talk with the researcher, and this way it can affect the results and lead to some biases? How do you think?
Yeah, I think that I certainly like the thing that I tried. I think that where I recognized there was an issue was I think it was more I what I encountered more was not that people were interested in talking to me because they thought they would get money directly, but were interested in talking to me because they thought I had some kind of influence on things that could come about later, right? And when I got the sense that that was the case, I would, end the interview, thank them for their time, give them something, but like didn't continue. That was more the problematic I came across was like when I saw that people thought that I had, because I was asking about this situation, they thought, oh, he is going to bring U.S. money to fund a project here, right? If I got any inkling that that was kind of like the reason they wanted to talk to me, I would just say like, that's not something I could do. I don't want to set up that expectation, and I want to be transparent. So I would usually kind of end things in that way. But I didn't find it was an issue of like that they were just meeting me because they thought they were going to get something. The problem I ran into was like they were expecting that I had some kind of special access and power that I certainly did not have, right? And as a poor graduate student, I wished I was the kind of person that they maybe expected. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, and I think that's also kind of trying to find through contacts you already have who are the people that would just genuinely be interested in talking. And I think also sometimes the kinds of questions, I remember there was a time I was talking to a sort of elder kind of community leader in a more rural area. And I think the fact that I was asking questions about culture and about like history and not like kind of the questions that NGOs tended to ask, people were actually quite excited or like were like just like people were just more interested, like we're just kind of, and I remember one of my friends afterwards saying like, oh, people were so happy that you were like asking this local leader about like these cultural things because I think it just kind of showed a respect or an interest and that it wasn't what they expected me to be asking them. To kind of connect back to that question of trust, right? Like they were expecting maybe I was looking for something else, and I was kind of offering, the fact that I was asking the kinds of questions I think changed the dynamic. So I think I always try to think about that as well. It's like what's compelling people. If there can be a good reason they are compelled to talk to you, and that's good. That they want to share their knowledge. They're interested in the fact that, and sometimes I would just also frame it as like, listen, I think South Sudan is misunderstood by people in my country. And so I'm trying to talk to people here so that they have an understanding that's based on, something real. And I think framed in that way kind of gave them a deeper sense of like what it was about and what they were, what they were doing by giving me some of their time, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Christian, quick question from my daughter.
For sure.
How long did you spend in South Sudan? Was it a kind of single stint or series of trips?
I spent in 2012. I went for like 2 preliminary research trips, and that was like about 2 months in 2012, 2 months in 2013, and then I spent most of 2015 there, so about a year. So like 18-ish months altogether. I think it also helped that I had lived in Uganda for 2 years previously, so I had kind of like a lot of, I don't know, I knew how to live and get by and interact with people in a similar cultural context. So I felt like that helped. But yeah, so about 18 months all told, but I did split it up a bit, which I think actually, because a lot changed in those couple of years, it was actually quite good to go in 2012, go in 2013, and then, go most of 2015 and keep in touch after. I kind of was able to kind of track some changes, see how people's lives kind of changed, see what happened over time, that I think was quite helpful for my my writing. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
Okay, does anyone have any question?
I think no.
Okay, again, thanks a lot for great and vivacious presentation, and thanks everybody for lively discussion, questions. Again, it's been rewarding experience. At a loss for words to express my gratitude to you, Christian. A great contribution to our department and our School of Sociology and Law and overall university community. Lots of thanks, and it's been a great beginning, and hope, as they say, to be continued.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you. It was such an honor to meet all of you, get to talk to you, and share some of my small insights. So, and I put my email address in the chat, but definitely I want to continue the conversation. Anytime you want to reach out, I'm always happy to continue the discussion. So, absolutely.
Certainly will. We certainly will. Let's discuss it in email exchange.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Food for thought, lots of inspiration, lots of motivation, lots of things to discuss with our students, PhD students in particular. Well, we don't discriminate, but PhD students should be singled out because it's kind of, again, cream of the crop perhaps would be too bombastic to say. But being a PhD student is challenging. It's rewarding, but at the same time, it's challenging because they have to come up with an original research and mastering these techniques, knowing them full well, all these nitty-gritty details is of utmost importance for the success of one's PhD project.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
A great day,
You
and
as well, yeah.
And friends and colleagues, kind of quiet evening and quiet night.
I hope so. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.